When I first imagined Kansas, the images that came to mind were of The Wizard of Oz. I imagined a rural landscape where farming, small towns, and the weather threat of tornadoes. As I began searching my memory for more images of Kansas, I recalled its state flower, sunflowers, and possible crops, corn and wheat. I had applied to Kansas State University to pursue my master's in English because of their children's lit track, but I hadn't given much thought about moving to Kansas until I had already accepted the offer and others were asking me questions. Most of the time, when I would tell people I was moving to Kansas, their faces would scrunch and they would ask, "Why Kansas?" And I would tell them I'm pursuing my master's in English at Kansas State University. And with my reply, I would see them partially relax their faces and then congratulate me. It was how fast they fixed their faces to congratulate me that always seemed a bit odd. Sometimes the moments before, "Why Kansas?" were followed by comments about Kansas's demographics, political values, and landscape. I don't know what was flashing through their minds as they made these comments. Were they trying to understand the differences of political values between Washington State and Kansas? And were they wondering what my values were? Were they trying to imagine the landscape of Kansas? Were they trying to place me, a mixed race woman in Kansas? I honestly don't know. I never asked. I just got to see them process my news. Kansas remained elusive to me until I came to visit K-State for visiting weekend, late March, early April 2023. I booked a plane ticket and began to piece myself together. I started noticing how the look and age of everything was different. The limestone buildings on the campus and around the town reminded me of the use of bricks at home. And I didn't realize how old K-State was until seeing the K-State sign. I was astonished at the age of K-State. I can't recall anything that old at home. And so it brought me to really consider the past and my present. And then when I arrived in Manhattan, I was shocked to see people of color and their connections to the local history because my perception of Kansas was that it would be rural and white. But instead, I saw pieces of home in the most unexpected ways. I took note of one of the main streets, Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, which reminded me of the street central to visiting my dad's house in Seattle, which I saw all through my childhood. As I was walking down the street onto campus, I also found a bust of Dr. King that began to help me place my Black heritage in Kansas. I began seeing my future and that there were others who looked like me in Kansas and that these people have been here. Before I keep going, I need to introduce you to who I am. My name is Elizabeth Elliott. I am a mixed race, queer, non binary woman. I was born and raised in Washington State, and my mother is Margaret Elliott, who also was born and raised in Washington, to her mother, Lucille Elizabeth Brown Elliott, who was born and raised in North Carolina. My mother's dad was part of the military and ended up at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and they settled in Tacoma. Both my grandmother and grandfather were teachers. This is my maternal lineage of my family, which from my mother to her mother ends here because my grandmother was adopted. I don't know the rest of my history. I can't know, so my knowledge from my maternal side ends with my grandmother, who died before I was born. I only know my grandmother in stories from my family, but I continued to be reminded of her as I started my journey in Kansas. Over the last 2 years, I have wondered, what are narratives of home in Kansas, and what does home mean for Black people in Kansas? I have been led to these questions because I struggled and still struggle with calling Kansas home, and I don't know what story to tell about my time at K State. For me, I am a fragmented, racialized, gendered, and sexed body, and while I have been learning what it means to leave home and to take up a new one, I am one perspective of many. Through my work in the archives to examine what and who is home in Kansas, I've learned there's so many stories that don't get to be told, and so many stories never preserved, that this story can never be complete. It can only be started, and so I start with my own stories and the connections I made with archival stories, and expand towards the lessons I'm taking away from reading these two together. I hope that this video inspires others to begin the process of placemaking what it means to be home. As I mentioned before, my perception of Kansas was from media, and so I imagined a rural landscape, which made me think Kansas would be rural and white. As I came to Kansas and saw other people of color, it still took time for me to realize the deep connections and roots for Black Kansans. The history of Black Kansans began to be revealed to me in my first semester of grad school. I was taking a linguistics class, and one of the class projects was to examine a historical corpus for language variation. The corpus was of Governor John Pierce St. John, and we focused on letters written to him, particularly from African American exodusters trying to migrate to Kansas. Exodusters were African Americans who migrated from the South to states in the North and the Midwest, both before and after Reconstruction ended. The period of the exodusters is typically identified as the late 1870s and the early 1880s. The specific letters I read in the St. John Corpus were the received letters he saved. When I was reading the letters, I began to piece a story together about what African Americans were seeking from Kansas: safety, land, education, to name a few. Letters by African Americans were identifiable because individuals would self identify, sometimes the types of resources they were asking for, or if it was written by someone else because the person might have been illiterate, they would identify their organization, and that would typically reveal the identity of both the writer and the person asking for resources. I also thought it was interesting, among these letters were also letters by white Kansans who supported the migration of African Americans in various ways. I found a letter of a white woman who was asking for the contact of a black woman to work in her home as domestic help. It was interesting to see some of the motivations of individuals. Now, looking back at some of the letters I took pictures of and saved, there is an interesting ask about Nicodemus, Kansas, which was founded in 1877 as a black settlement that many exodusters moved to in Kansas. It is also the oldest and only remaining black settlement west of the Mississippi River. The community in Nicodemus continues to remember their history and call it to attention with the ways in which they remember the past and make it present in the reality through archival research projects, historical restoration, and cultural investment. I wonder why this was not something I learned about Kansas. Instead, my image was rurality and whiteness. And even though I knew the history that Kansas was a free state and was foundational in the Civil War, it took me becoming aware of my surroundings to see how Kansas has been home to Black Kansans and my ability to be connected in Kansas with my mixed race heritage. I was not alone when I was here in the ways that I had first imagined. Instead, I was connected to the deep history. I just had to see what was around me. The room of the Kansas State Archive begins to show these images of Kansas. And most notably for me is that it shows Brown versus Board of Education. As I reflect on my initial interactions with Black history in Kansas, I must acknowledge that I didn't at first realize that Brown versus Board of Education happened in Kansas until I was on the way to visit the St. John's Corpus last fall. And yet, once I did, it became so central to the story and my story in Kansas. Throughout my time at K State, I struggled with the act of teaching as a graduate teaching assistant and instructor of record. It's hard to know that this is like that I'm not the educator I want to be, but this is the educator I am right now. And like I'm doing better every day, but it's hard to imagine like I don't even think imagine's the right word. It's more like it's hard to swallow the educator I am versus the educator I want to be. And like each day is a step towards that educator, but it's really hard right now. And like of course I need to like do this
to become that educator. But it's hard to feel like I'm not failing my class and that I'm not feeling like myself. Like if I want to be the teacher I I wish I had, that I wish like had been there for me, I need to show up like that. But I don't have a framework for what that looks like.
This is a video diary I took in my first semester teaching. One of the things I learned as a teacher is context matters. And so, me not having a context and touch point for Kansas made it really hard to teach my students. And as I became more aware and connected to my surroundings, I found a way into my classroom space and into how to share my own identity and stories with my students. I found a way into my classroom space where I could proceed with care, stories, and responsibility. Understanding the story of teaching in Kansas is important as I think about my continued relationship to the classroom space and how I show up as a teacher who takes up space as a non binary femme, as a mixed race, non binary femme teacher. And thinking about my connections with my grandmother and grandfather who were teachers, I continue to think about the way in which I was a legacy of teaching and education. I also continue to return to the privilege to teach, the privilege to learn, and the responsibility I had in both spaces. And this is what I continue to think about as I think about the question, what and who is home in Kansas, and my own relationship to this question. As I started to think about this image of Kansas and the people who we think of when we think of Kansas, I started Googling it and I ended up finding someone who was in my cohort last year. It surprised me because the image of people in Kansas isn't in the past, it's in the present and continues to be shaped and changed. And it's interconnected to this migration that happened during the Exodusters and continued migration into Kansas by other people of color. They have and are here. We are here. Memories, history, culture, and imagination is what allows Kansas to exist in multiple ways and forms. And as I've navigated personal, historical, and community stories, I've learned how Black Kansans carry stories, reclaim connections, and call Kansas home. Kansas has and is home to African Americans, and to see that I had to become aware of my surroundings. I learned through the archive that it's a place of stories. The archive is not just a place that holds documents, it holds connections and possibilities when we take it as a story. Archival work to me is the practice of listening and learning how to tell stories. The archive holds so many stories waiting to be told if only we are ready to listen. The archive helped me start to tell my story of being in Kansas as a biracial, queer, non binary woman from Washington State, and to start becoming present to my surroundings and environment. I found a way to start responding to the question, what is home? Home is in my heart. For me, it revolves around the people who help me see myself and be present. I have many homes now. The one here in Kansas, the one I have in Washington, and even within the fractions of family and friends, each of those is a home I can return to. I learned more about the questions I had for myself when it comes to calling and making and maintaining my Kansas home, which in itself will change after this next year, as no one has to stay. We are all from other places, and we found each other here. So, what will Kansas mean for me when I leave? Perhaps this is why I'm interested in how individuals continue to see themselves and make Kansas home despite not being represented. This is a story I chose to tell, but it might not be the right story. It's not the only story for sure, but this is my story. I was here. I called Kansas home. I'm creating this video for others who couldn't at first name, describe, or begin to imagine themselves and their identities in the context of Kansas. Who are you, stranger? Will you see and understand what I've explored, even if I'm not able to yet scratch the surface of who we are? I'm giving you tools, language, and love to shape change, to tell your stories because your stories matter. They're everything.